Good day to all, and welcome to the Balfour Project's two-day conference entitled Abandoning Palestine and Our Continuing Responsibility. My name is Vincent Fean. Today we will focus on the collapse of the British mandate. Tomorrow we will look at why it still matters, Britain's responsibility to advance equal rights, and what we, that is civil society, parliament and government, should do now with our like-minded partners around the world. The Balfour Project has a clear aim: peace, justice and equal rights in Israel-Palestine. Our mission is to acknowledge Britain's historical and continuing responsibilities, and through popular education and advocacy, to uphold equal rights for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples. We ask the British government to recognise the state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel, a policy decision long overdue, as we shall hear today from Hanan Ashrawi, our keynote speaker. To set the scene, let's first look at a short newsreel report from the very last day of the mandate in May 1948, when the Union Jack was lowered in Haifa for the last time. The newsreel clip that you will see is very much of its time. It was shown to audiences in cinemas before the advent of television. It tries to be upbeat, bombastic even, but you will detect that the tone is somewhat forced. Here's the clip.
At Haifa, the last British troops leave Palestine, and very few of them can have been sorry. As the tanks and soldiers went aboard the transports, the thought that a difficult and thankless job had been well done must have mattered much less than the prospect of going home. Lieutenant General Macmillan, their CNC, was on the quayside as embarkation went forward. The Union Jack was hauled down and the doors closed for good on the British mandate. Later in the day, Israel's flag was flying over Haifa, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Ben-Gurion, was there for the taking over ceremony. A sad chapter had closed, and the world hopes that UNO will be able to find a satisfactory solution to the Palestine problem.
Well, we're still waiting for the United Nations organization to find a solution. Perhaps the most shocking thing about the clip is that it contains no reference whatsoever to the Palestinian Arabs. They do not appear. They are entirely absent from it. There is no reference to their rights, to what was happening to them, or to their likely fate. It does not mention the fact that they were the majority of the population of Palestine in 1948. The clip ends with the appearance on Haifa quayside of David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of the newly proclaimed State of Israel, with his soldiers. Viewers in British cinemas could easily be deceived into thinking that there had been an orderly transfer of power, just as they could be deceived into thinking that there had never been a people called Palestinian Arabs. Did you pick up the references to a job well done by the soldiers and a thankless task? The reporter is trying to paper over the cracks, but knows that all was not as it should have been. Far from it. It is the ignorance and selective amnesia contained in this news report, selective amnesia which is still all too prevalent, that we are determined to address today and tomorrow, with the help of our diverse and distinguished guest speakers. They will all speak their minds in their own right. Their views do not necessarily accord with those of the Balfour Project charity, which will set out its own opinion in a statement at the end of the conference, a statement which engages the Balfour Project only. We begin today with thoughts from two Palestinians. First, the reflections of Hanan Ashrawi about Britain's role, which she shared with me a few days ago. She will be followed by Dr. Ghada Karmi, who vividly remembers the day when, as a child, she and her family left their home in Jerusalem for fear of their lives. This at a time when Britain was responsible for their security. Ghada is both an eyewitness and a victim of the Nakba, the catastrophe, which continues to this day. Lord Cope, patron of the British Palestine Police Association, will then talk about the experiences of the young British police officers whose impossible, thankless task was to maintain law and order in the dying years and days of the mandate post-World War II. They will be followed by three historians. First is Professor Avi Schleim, who will talk about Britain's betrayal of Palestine from Balfour to Bevin. Avi will take questions immediately after his talk. So if you have a question for him, please type it into the chat. After a 5-minute break, Roger Hardy will show us photos taken by the Haganah and then the Israeli Defense Force, which actually provide documentary evidence of the Nakba. We will conclude with John McHugo's presentation on the legal chaos and legal vacuum that Britain bequeathed to Palestine at the end of the mandate. A betrayal of that legally binding, quote, sacred trust of civilization, unquote. That's from the Charter of the League of Nations, to prepare the people of Palestine for independence. That was a charge that Britain assumed at the start of the mandate. Britain deliberately withheld from the Palestinian people their right to self-determination, that right which is still withheld today. Tomorrow's session is at the same time and will be chaired by Dr. Phyllis Starkey. We will look at why Britain's failure in Palestine still matters and ask what Britain, civil society, parliament, government should do now to advance equal rights. Victor Catan will introduce a presentation by Michael Link, read on Michael's behalf by John McHugo, on the infamous British emergency regulations of 1945, which Israel has used as a legal tool as part of the structure of its occupation. This will be followed by the recorded thoughts of Rory Stewart in conversation with me on Britain's foreign policy now. The conference will conclude with two panels. The first is of Palestinians living in this country, in the UK, who will reflect on what happened to their families, what it feels like, what it is like to be a Palestinian in Britain today, and will include their reflections on how Palestine is viewed compared with Ukraine. The second and last panel of the day is a panel of members of Parliament: David Jones, Conservative; Julie Elliott, Labour; Layla Moran from the Lib Dems; Tommy Shepherd, SNP, the four main political parties of the UK. They will address the question, what should our Parliament press the British government to do today to advance equal rights? There'll be time for questions to the MPs, so if you have a question for them, please type it into the chat. Equally important, what should our government not do to avoid making matters worse? I'll come back to that towards the end of today's session at around 6:20 UK time. The full recording of today's proceedings will be made available overnight on our website, www.balfourproject.org. Likewise, tomorrow's session will be recorded and can be viewed on that website overnight on Wednesday. Our first guest is Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, former member of the PLO Executive Committee. Today, she is in the United States with a busy schedule, so she kindly recorded this conversation with me a few days ago, actually before the tragic killing in Jenin of Shireen Abu Akleh. We must remember Shireen and work to ensure that her killing marks a turning point. Let me read what Hanan wrote. Quote, "Our beloved Shireen, a genuine daughter of Palestine, encapsulates the best we aspire to, a force for unity, humanity, courage, humility, integrity, resistance, empathy, truthfulness, dedication, professionalism, and moral power. Her last stand embodies the ultimate sacrifice." Unquote. May Shireen rest in peace. And so to Hanan. I asked her to give her assessment of Britain's role through the Balfour Declaration and up to the end of the mandate. Here is what she said.
Certainly that period to us is absolutely tragic. It's probably the worst era in Palestinian history. And at the same time, it launched a whole new process, a whole new reality in Palestine, and set the standards for all sorts of painful dealings, all sorts of attitudes and mindsets and stereotypes and labels that persist, some of them till today. But primarily, it also tried to legitimize a very exclusivist ideology, which is the Zionist ideology. And it tried to give it concretely a reality at the expense of the Palestinians. That was, again, one of the foundations of the ongoing Israeli control, expansionism, and annexation of Palestine. The grand theft of Palestine, let's put it that way. At the same time, they also set the tone in the Balfour Declaration primarily for the dismissal and the negation and almost the erasure of the Palestinian people by defining us, as you know, by what we are not. We are the non-Jewish communities. We are not a nation or a people that is pluralistic and diverse and at the same time harmonious with a national identity. No, we are non-Jewish communities, Christian and Muslim. So it's not a question of the Palestinian people existing as a people with a history, with a culture, with aspirations and with rights, but we are not Jewish, even though we were the majority and the Jewish population was a very small minority, but at the same time, they were Palestinian, for heaven's sake. So the selection of one religious group for exceptional and special treatment to legitimize, again, the Zionist ideology and the exclusivist sense of entitlement and being special, in a sense, has laid the foundations for this ongoing narrative. But at the same time, the negation of the Palestinian right to self-determination, this is true. Our human rights, let alone political, social, etc., they only said we had, Balfour said we had religious and civil rights.
Exactly.
But didn't mention anything about the right to self-determination, as you rightfully said, human rights, political rights, or any other rights. So these communities somehow, existing had religious and civil rights, but had no national rights, the right to self-determination, to freedom, dignity, justice, and so on. So that's another serious issue. And ultimately, in the end, they succeeded in setting, again, the foundation for the future violations or the ongoing violations. The violence we will talk about in terms of the mandate and so on, and the violence against the Palestinians, the brutality, of course. But to move on to the issue of imposition of a set of laws that continue to be used until now.
Yes.
This is how Israel is systematically and illegally oppressing the Palestinians. All the administrative laws, all the so-called emergency laws, whether house demolitions, which are now on the rampage, whether the issue of expulsion, deportation, and so on, censorship, extrajudicial executions even, the issue of security, and so on. But along with all these set of laws that Israel uses, there is also the mentality of the colonial mentality of, I said the white man's burden, but it's hard to define that in a sense. But it proved that Israel is really a colonial outpost and is behaving in a colonial way and has inherited the tools and the language, including the language of a colonial power that seems to think it has superior rights, superior powers, and can, reinvent reality at will. So all these are patterns that in some ways persist till now and have become a way in which Israel is trying to totally erase the Palestinians through ethnic cleansing, house demolitions, expulsions, killing, but primarily land confiscation and annexation.
We will hear from Avi Schleim later about what he calls the betrayal by Britain of Palestine from Balfour through to Bevin, so from 1917 to 48. Yes. And you're quite right about the prolongation of emergency laws. I think Professor Michael Link will talk to us about the emergency regulations, which are still in place, adopted by Israel, and which permit or give some cover to administrative detention, house demolitions, and the things that you have named. So in that sense, the legacy of the British mandate is still with us. Yeah, absolutely. And it's this legacy that was used, exploited by Israel, in a sense, with a whole body of legal and instrumental issues that were at its disposal. So it is behaving in an outright way as a colonial power. But the thing is, it is more than that. It's a settler colonial power because it is based on the negation of the Palestinians entirely, not just in terms of our rights and so on, but also in terms of our very existence, our very narrative, our history, our culture. What is being confiscated is more than just the land, as we said, the narrative, the culture, everything else. So that has been ongoing, and the mandate provided it with the tools to pursue this. But at the same time, another thing which is very serious, which is Israeli impunity. And I think Israel has been emboldened by this patronage of the West. And it can be not just Britain, not just the UK, but certainly many European countries and primarily now the US that has inherited this patronage of Israel as a favored ally and so on. So it feels protected, in a sense, exempt from international law and compliance with human rights, international human rights law and so on, and continues till now to feel that it does have and deserve preferential treatment and exceptionalism. Last year, the Balfour Project held another virtual conference on international law with speakers such as Baroness Hale, the former president of our Supreme Court, and Dominic Grieve and others, and again, Michael Link, talking about the search for the rule of law in Israel-Palestine. And it is a search which is hard to find, if I can put it that way. The rule of law is not the rule of international law, despite despite the sequence of UN Security Council resolutions since 2042, despite the Geneva Conventions, on the ground, the rule of law, as seen as promoted by the international community, is not to be found.
No, you're absolutely right. I think what we call the global rule of law, because bodies and instruments and whole sets of laws and so on were established in order to hold the powerful to account and in order to provide the weak and the vulnerable with protection. These things have been absent from our part of the world in the sense that the powerful, which is Israel as an occupying power, was rewarded and protected and granted the right license to act with full impunity, while the Palestinians are under pressure, constantly threatened and so on, without any intervention by the international community. As you said, even the UN resolutions, including the latest 2334, were not honored, were not implemented, and Israel literally got away with murder. The law doesn't apply when it comes to Israel. And there is no intention or political will to hold Israel to account or to apply this global rule of law when it comes to Israel. So that has created a greater asymmetry of power, a greater imbalance. It has further victimized the vulnerable, and it has further emboldened and empowered the powerful. And that's why Israel feels that it can replace all of Palestine, historical Palestine, with greater Israel. And that's what it's doing in many ways.
Can we talk a little bit about the role of the international community, including the UK, of course? We talk in the Balfour Project about continuing British responsibility. We see a duty on Britain, civil society, parliament, government, all of us, to do more, to do better, to uphold human rights, to uphold equal rights. The reality that I lived as Consul General and that you see is that the British government tends to look to the United States, partly expediently to the United States for a lead. And some of our politicians talk about the need for leadership from Israel, leadership from the Palestinians to address the issues. And today's reality is that there is no Middle East peace process because the present Prime Minister of Israel and his deputy both say they don't intend to talk to Palestine, to the Palestinians, about final status issues. So in that rather barren terrain, where do you see the role of the international community and indeed the role of the UK today?
That certainly is a loaded question. Let's say it's a very rich and diverse question. But let's say from the beginning, of course, the international community bears responsibility for not upholding its own standards and systems and laws and so on, not honoring them, not holding Israel to account in accordance with them, and not acting on the basis of principles and values that they claim they hold dear. And this has become extremely apparent when people look at the immediate massive response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and as opposed to all this, not just procrastination, but refusal to in any way help the Palestinians or hold Israel to account, as we said. So this type of racism and hypocrisy has become quite evident to everybody, regardless of where you stand on the issues. Of course, we as Palestinians support the victims, and we don't like to see people lose their homes and liberties and land and so on. But at the same time, we would like to be given similar, if not the same consideration as vulnerable people whose land has been usurped and who's been subject to systemic violence and systematic violence for decades now. And we're supposed to sit down and behave like good little boys and girls. And should we in any way react to this massive aggression and violence against us, we are all labeled as terrorists, as you know. It was very ironic how The US was furious at Russia's use of the veto, but they forgot how many vetoes they used in order to protect Israel when it came to Palestine. And at the same time, they were teaching them how to use Molotov cocktails. But our children, should they improvise anything to stand up to Israel, they are shot and killed on the spot. And they are labeled terrorists, you know. So there is this clear disparity, this clear, not disproportionality, but in a sense, collusion with Israel has become obvious. And of course, the racism is obvious, which to me is also part of this continuum of colonial rule and the colonial mentality and the colonial sets of instruments that Israel had inherited and used. And that's why there is, I don't want to say a responsibility in the sense that you have to deal with Palestine with economic assistance here and there, asking us to protect the safety of the settlers and the army, do not resort to violence in any way, do not describe reality as it is, not the textbook issue, and even the prisoner issue and the martyrs' families and so on. It's as if we are supposed to forget our history and teach the Israeli version, the Israeli narrative of what's happening, which is entirely in contradiction with reality. This is the issue of textbooks that Israel imposed on the West, particularly on Europe and the US. And the same thing with the payment to prisoners, as though our prisoners are all terrorists and somehow, and that we are encouraging terrorism. It's not a question of freedom fighters and responsibility and a liberation movement. All these things, this has become very clear. Now, what do we do? And in a sense, I believe that there has to be a rectification of the past, certainly. There has to be, I don't want to use religious terminology, but a contrition, confession, satisfaction. There has to be, in a sense, a recognition of the guilt in itself. Instead of this denial constantly, we are a classic case of the victim being blamed constantly for what happened to us and being forced in many ways to behave like good victims. I said, we cannot expect the Palestinians to lie down and die quietly. It's not going to happen. And we're not going to have collective amnesia, and we're not going to go into self-exile and so on. We're here to stay, and we're going to stay. We're paying a heavy price, but that's it. So this recognition of the fact that Palestinians deserve equal rights is crucial from the beginning. And the recognition of the legitimacy and the reality of the Palestinian narrative identity and history. This has to happen because Israel has been either denying or distorting our reality and our history. So when people speak out, when you have organizations who are validating this narrative, it begins the process of redemption. Let's put it that way. Validate the reality of the narrative, challenge the false narrative and the misleading labels that have been used against us. But at the same time, governments, I mean, people have been acting for a long time, but not enough in ways as to influence official decisions. This is a unique case where in many cases the people are in advance, are way ahead of the governments. The governments have their own considerations and so on, and at the same time, they take decisions that are not consistent with what their constituency wants. This is very strange, because whenever we ask for anything, they say, well, our constituency wouldn't accept. But when you look at parliaments, when you look at public opinion polls, there is an increasing sense of recognition of the justice of the Palestinian cause and aspirations and rights. And it's very clear that it is, all these are consistent with international humanitarian law, with the values that people say they hold dear, and yet they are not in any way officially recognized or used as a motive for action. So by moving, by creating a global conversation, not just a dialogue, I think we are becoming, and we see this in the States also, part of a global conversation on peace, on justice, on freedom, on human dignity, on rights as pertaining to our people. The moment the world recognizes Palestinians as having equal rights and that we have the right to live in freedom and dignity on our own land, then you begin the redemptive process. Then you begin the process of rectification. But so long as you suffer, not you, I mean, governments and so on, suffer from this, not just short-sightedness, but willful blindness, not to see. You were Consul General, you saw everything in Jerusalem, right? You saw everything in the West Bank. I'm sure you wrote many reports, you witnessed, you testified and so on. Did that change your government policy? I don't know, because we still meet with one CG after the other, one diplomat after the other, and we still talk, and they still see what's going on the ground, and they still send their reports, and governments do not change. And policies still continue to exercise willful blindness, if not total identification with Israel, the way the American administrations have done. I mean, Trump became a partner in crime with Israel, but Biden now is back to the usual pro-Israeli, blind Zionist adherence to what's good for Israel is good for the US and vice versa and so on. So this has to be challenged, this mentality, this mindset. And the only way to challenge it is with the truth, with making reality heard, and of course with the public acting and with linkages, as you have done with Hafsa and others, with Palestinians. So you know the narrative, you're there, you're working with people, you're helping directly alleviate not just the suffering, but help people become resilient and even more resilient in facing Israeli aggression and attempts at ethnic cleansing and erasure. So that's important. And the moment you give the Palestinians this reality, this concrete reality, it becomes more and more difficult for Israel, although it hasn't been so far, to use Palestine as killing fields, you know, those trigger-happy soldiers. Every day we have Palestinian people killed. That's not violence. But should an Israeli soldier or settler get killed, that's the end of the world. It's, you know, they're innocent victims. Not that they are guilty of war crimes. No, they're innocent victims and the Palestinians are terrorists. So the description is also misleading. So the moment this happens, and there's a cumulative, incremental process of unlearning what has been learned, which is wrong, and of validating a new discourse that describes things as they are without intimidation and without fear. I mean, the greatest instrument, the greatest threat that is used is the label of anti-Semitism for anybody who dares to challenge the Israeli narrative or policy or practices or measures, and who in any way tries to validate the Palestinian reality. So that now is being in many ways debunked. That's very important. The more people stand up to Israel, the more they defy this type of intimidation, whether the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism or even the labeling of anybody of BDS as being a crime or criminalizing BDS, because you cannot in any way use sanctions against Israel or hold it to account. All these things. So with BDS, with holding Israel to account, with changing policies, with accepting the fact that your public, your people can act in accordance with their conscience in terms of being ethical and moral consumers and investors by not cooperating with the Israeli occupation, at least. I mean, not just labeling, but not importing and settlement products, and moving from there to understand that without a price to be paid, without consequences, Israel will persist.
Can I ask you a couple of things? One is on just to say what the Balfour Project thinks we advocate recognition of the state of Palestine alongside Israel on pre-June 67 lines. It's something that's been in the air for so long. Sweden recognized in 2014. Britain would have, I think, a major psychological impact, not only psychological, but also legal impact, were it to do so. This government at the moment is not so minded. The Labour Party, the Scots Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats all say that they would, but they're not in office. The Balfour Project advocates a ban on settlement products and applying international law.
Yeah.
And finally, and perhaps closer to home, we advocate, as I know you do, elections in Palestine to clarify and to refresh the body politic in Palestine and to try to secure unity of purpose. Of those things, Hanan, are we on the right track? And what would you prioritize, I suppose? What would you seek to push?
Yeah, well, recognition of Palestine, as you rightfully said, is important and is long overdue. And people have been using this as both a carrot and a stick. We'll do it at the right time, at the end of the peace process, at the end of the conflict. We'll do it in coordination with others. And I mean, there are so many excuses that can be used not to do that. The issue of recognition of Palestine should be a foregone conclusion. There are many countries that have recognized Palestine. Even the UN has recognized Palestine as a state, albeit a non-member state, but it doesn't matter, still a state. That, in many ways, deprives Israel and pro-Israeli governments from using this as an excuse to punish Palestine and to avoid any kind of sanctions on Israel or accountability. This has always been used as an excuse. Even when we went to the ICC, it took us years and years for the International Criminal Court to accept us as a state. The previous one, I forgot his name, who became an advisor to Israel, by the way, previous prosecutor before Bensouda, told us, go and become a state or go to the UN and get recognition as a state, then come to us and prove you're a state and so on. And now we know why he did all these things. Bensouda tried hard. We got our ducks in a row, so to speak. We have all the information, all the evidence. We became a state, a non-member state, but a state. And that, in a sense, enabled us to start this process. And it took 6 years for preliminary investigation to begin. It took 6 days in Ukraine, even though neither Ukraine nor Russia are members, for an investigation to start. Tells you about the double standards and the racism and so on. So here we are. I think in a sense there are very special, it's not just symbolic, there are issues that can help the Palestinian cause if you recognize the Palestinian state, and once you do, and we will not have these people writing the ICC on behalf of Israel saying, since we are not a state, we do not have the right to access to the ICC and international instruments and bodies that are of judiciary nature. So that's one thing. Two, it changes the relationships. But alas, I'm afraid that you're a bit late because not only has Israel created facts, Israel is busy destroying the possibility of an independent state in Palestine. Israel has reframed the whole issue into a question of a Palestinian population centers, and that we may have maybe civil rights, not Balfour, but not political rights or the right to self-determination, heaven forbid. So they are busy destroying all the requirements of statehood. So I don't want a statelet or a mini state or whatever. I don't want a state in mind, in name, but I want a real state that is viable, that is on Palestinian soil, that is capable of not just survival, but of development, of bringing together all Palestinians from everywhere. But Unfortunately, with the persistence and the entrenchment and the more extreme racist nature of Zionism, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to say a sovereign, independent Palestinian state can be created on what's left of historical Palestine. It's a painful thing to admit, but that's what's happening. Now, recognizing the Palestinian state helps Palestinian resilience and the ability to check Israeli excesses and violations and violence and aggression. But would it rescue Palestinian statehood, given the fact that Israel has been given a free hand, time and space to do what it wants for so long, and to steal the land and the resources and to make life sheer hell for Palestinians? Look at Gaza. Gaza is not just under siege, but it's sitting duck for Israeli shelling and killing and bombing and giving itself the right, to control from long distance airspace, territorial waters, and the state of siege. And they say we're not an occupying power. This is one of the worst occupations in history, where you have all the power and all the violence and all the pain that you can inflict without any responsibility and without any accountability. That's one. In the West Bank, the land theft is ongoing. Look at the annexation of Jerusalem. I mean, the American embassy is still in Jerusalem. We call it a settlement in Jerusalem. The systematic transformation of the city, of its history, of its culture, of its demography, ethnic cleansing is ongoing. Look at what's happening at Al-Aqsa. Look at the way they treat not just the Muslim worshippers, but the Christian worshippers. This year, last year, Easter ceremonies, Easter services, people were prevented from going to their own places of worship, be it Christian or Muslim. All Ramadan was just a series of Israeli incursions and attacks. So this is the reality. What kind of state do you expect when Israel is swallowing up the land, stealing the resources, making life impossible, fragmenting the Palestinians, not just with the wall. Now, as you see, all the infrastructure. I talked earlier about superimposing a whole grid on the West Bank of everything, services and infrastructure of electricity, apartheid roads on the West Bank, so that the settler reality becomes the primary reality and the ancient but ongoing Palestinian reality becomes the secondary reality, surrounded by apartheid roads, totally excluded and divided from each other without access to their own land or resources anyway. So what kind of state? I mean, people sat around and waited and watched Israel destroy the so-called two-state solution that the world forced on us. I told you, it wasn't our choice. It wasn't our preferred choice. We wanted one secular or non-sectarian democratic state where everybody can live in peace. This came out in the late 60s, as you know. And it was totally rejected. And people sat around and watched Israel expand and create a forgery in Palestine. To us, Israel is an artificial construct that has been created on Palestine, and it has continued to grow and grow and grow with international support, Western support, at the expense of the indigenous people. And everybody would say, look, we recognize your state, we've done our national duty, that's it. Or we are for a two-state solution, so that's fine. Go back to negotiations. Negotiations have become a tool of power for Israel to buy more time, to create more facts, to destroy the two-state solution. I've seen this, personally over the years. And then people say, no, the best thing is to resume negotiations. What negotiations? On what basis? With whom? When Israel now clearly says what it has been doing all along. No to the right of self-determination of the Palestinians, no to withdrawal, and yes to annexation. And so, in a sense, there's nothing left to deal with. When people tell us give us creative ideas about the solution. I say, it's not my responsibility. You allowed Israel to destroy the two-state solution. What alternatives do you have? Are you willing to support a one-state solution, a democratic, inclusive, non-sectarian state in which everybody can live in peace and dignity and freedom as an equal under the law? What alternatives do you have for allowing Israel to destroy the possibility even of an emergence of a contiguous Palestinian state that is capable of surviving, let alone thriving and developing? So that's why people are beginning to talk about the end of the two-state solution. And they have been talking about it for a long time. So long as the Zionist project is there, frankly speaking, so long as Israel maintains this ideology of racism, exclusivity, and exclusion, and a sense of superiority and entitlement, there can never be either coexistence or neighboring states, frankly. I think the de-Zionization of Israel is very important. I think that should be looked at, in which you treat people as equal human beings, not as a group with privilege based on ethnicity or religion that can create exclusive sets and exclusive states. Suppose I said I want a purely Christian or a purely Muslim state, and everybody else, may exist but has no equal rights. Wouldn't the world be in an uproar? So our discourse, our language, our expressions, they have to change if we are to cope with the reality that is changing, that has been imposed by the impunity of an extremely racist, hardline, right-wing successive Israeli governments, motivated with racist ideologies. And to cope with that, not only with that, but to render our values active and applicable.
Thank you very much, Hanan. I think you've summed things up. I'd like to ask you one last question, which is about hope.
Oh,
the
elections, yes.
well, that's one aspect, but I was thinking about the idea that you aired of a conversation across the world about equality, about equal rights, about the rule of law. The young people, the people who are not going away in Palestine, and if you wish to mention elections, then elections. But just to conclude, if you can, because I know you are a person of hope and of determination, where do you see the hope?
Yes, exactly. I see hope in the younger generation, definitely. Generation after generation of Palestinians have not surrendered, and they have maintained primarily not just our resilience, but our ability to stay on the land. This is very important. I know we have almost, if not more than half of our people in exile or as refugees and expats. But still, nobody has forgotten Palestine or has acted as though they are outside Palestine, therefore they are outside the framework and mindset and commitment to Palestine. No, that is the hope, that the old may have died off, but the young have not forgotten. They have inherited an ongoing legacy of struggle, and they are using the contemporary tools. Tools that can reach others, debunking myths, exposing lies, challenging Israeli versions, and at the same time mobilizing with other people, like-minded people all over the world, because now there is a language of rights, of values that is applicable to everybody. And as I said earlier, we are part of the conversation globally. This is important to us, the younger generation. I mean, the older generations, including myself, have not given up. This is very important. We have not surrendered, as Jared Kushner and others and Daniel Pipes tried to persuade us that we have to accept our defeat. We didn't fight a war to be defeated. We may be under occupation, but our spirit has not been defeated. We have not surrendered, and we will not, contrary to Trump and his people. So the thing is, how do you translate that into active policies with like-minded people to influence decision-making? not just to hold Israel in check, but to begin to unravel, to dismantle the reality that was created. This is important. Now, part of our empowerment is through elections, is through a change of leadership, is through the peaceful transfer of power, is to bring the marginalized and the young and the people who have the spirit and the will to bring about change. And we have a remarkable younger generation. The only way to get them into power is through elections. And unfortunately, the older generations are staying put. They are resisting the challenge to have elections and to make room for the young. And the worst thing that can happen is if the young and the women and the men feel excluded and or abandon the democratic struggle and the struggle to change Palestine. We need to mobilize everybody in order to empower the Palestinian people as a whole. So this is important as far as I'm concerned for the young, but there is also hope in the changing dynamics, awareness in the world that you cannot continue like this. Sooner or later, people will recognize, understand what's happening, and will try to start dealing with it in order to end it, because it's the longest ongoing. I mean, there are other situations of injustice, but it's ongoing, it's daily, it's a situation of constant pain and victimization, and people feel that, and people will begin to change ultimately. But also a new awareness is coming up, and a new sense of solidarity, identification, and empathy is emerging. This, I feel, hope, with internal empowerment and resilience, with external engagement with the world, with challenges, standing up to Israel. The important thing is not to be intimidated and not to surrender. That's very important. And to believe that we are capable of change. And we are capable of standing up to injustice, to racism, to violence, to aggression. We can do that. And we can do that when we act with a collectivity. And the main source of our power is the truth. Get it out there, and stand up to any kind of aggression and justice. And we will get there. I'm sure we will. It will take time. It's very painful. It's a long process. But we have withstood all the things that were thrown at us in many different expressions of violence and injustice. And I think this is something that we can take in stride and move ahead. And the more people who stand with us and who speak out, the better.
Thank you very much, Hanan. And on that note, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. And we look forward to further conversations and to joining that global conversation, which I know you will have with the United States and around the world. And you haven't given up, and I didn't expect you to. And we wish you well, and we wish that the values that you expound win the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vincent. We appreciate all your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye.
Our thanks to Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. As we explained at the beginning of that interview, that conversation, Hanan is in the United States today and therefore cannot be with us to answer questions. What we will do is to send to Hanan by email the questions and the comments that have been put into the chat during her talk. Thank you.